Hello and welcome back to Parley. This one is from vampbug. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about seasonal build option rotation. Vampbug says September Parley, a MOBA like League of Legends or Dota, but with a seasonal rotation of characters and build paths. Thoughts? Potential problems? Go for it. Have a good rest of your day as well. Hey, you too. Thanks. This is a very exciting idea. So the couple of premises to get out of the way, actually maybe a lot of premise stuff in this parlay, and then I got kind of three things I want to talk about. So the initial pitch here is that you have a MOBA, as you said, multiplayer online battle arena. That's always been one of the genres of all time that has been named. League of Legends or Dota. So these are generally games where you're looking from the top down and you play a unit that you sort of move around the battlefield and progress through sort of lanes of invasion into the opponent's base, and you try to destroy the opponent's base. These games generally have a progression mechanic where as you kill the little minions or get kills on opponents or destroy towers or kill enemies in the jungle or whatever, you get gold and you can use that to buy items. These games are an interesting example themselves. You could do a whole parlay another time about the way in which these games have build systems. The way I'll summarize it for now is that you're often not really intended to choose what you build. Generally, options in the game are available so that you can counterplay the opponent. At least that's how it was when I played, which was a long time ago. So for example, maybe you're playing a character that does physical damage. Now you can get critical chance and armor piercing, and there's armor, and you can get those things. But if the items are well balanced, which I think they were relatively well balanced when I played, you know how this is going to go in the abstract. It's going to be best to mix them evenly. It probably won't be best to stack like a bunch of one thing, unless your opponents, noticing that you're doing a lot of damage, build a bunch of armor, and then you maybe would want to build multiple of an item that is better against more armor, or they build thorn mail so you take damage when you attack them, and then you build more lifesteal so that you can keep attacking them without dying. You get it. Those are kind of made up examples, though those things do all exist in League of Legends. I'm just explaining that the buildcraft is kind of there for the purpose of counterplay. You make a build, but there's essentially one or two only choices that plays to what is good in this situation in the game, using the tools your archetype has available. It's generally not intended that you actually make like a specific build that does something different, though you can do that. One of the first creators that I watched a lot of was one Civ HD, who made these videos where he would kind of reinterpret the champions in League of Legends with some kind of janky playstyle that would have like a bunch of items built around it to emphasize an aspect of their kit that maybe wasn't as intended as the others, but still worked. They still added scaling to this ability, so you could build around it in a particular way that just wasn't particularly intended to be that good. This has become a pretty common genre in League of Legends content over the years. I would say that the some of it is basically that you can make abilities do a lot of burst damage, which often looks good in video reels. I'm not sure it actually is all that great in gameplay a lot of the time, but some of them are good. Some of them went on to become things that were used quite frequently. He would do something that seemed a little janky at the time, but over the years that actually did catch on. They weren't all just bad but fun necessarily, though there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. Anyway, so the thing about these games, though, I told you there was going to be a lot of exposition in this one, is that a lot of the time they progress their metagame. They sort of shake up the gameplay or what is happening in a match by moving forward. We're going to come back to the idea of moving forward and balancing instead of, coming back around or something. We're going to come back around to coming back around. Great. Good, Sandy. Nice one. What I mean is that they would often release a new powerful thing, and now the meta is going in that direction. People are building a ton of lifesteal, and then Thornmail, which is meant to counter the heavy attack damage characters, isn't working. So we're going to make a character that's really good at assassinating attack damage characters with lifesteal or something. Again, I'm kind of just making this up as an example. You get it. And League of Legends would do things like that. New characters would pretty frequently be super OP right when they came out, or relatively OP. And remember, they're already really powerful because people don't know how to play around them. A lot of people are not familiar with them and don't know what they do. That already makes them stronger than the competition in some way. And so if they're balanced to be more powerful on purpose than other characters, they generally dominate quite heavily. Of course, they wanted you to buy the new character right away so they could make money, and then they sort of balance them down afterward a lot of the time. This is probably not much of a need to argue too heavily that this is a not great, if you want a good, interesting choices game, way to make a video game. It is a way primarily motivated by keeping the game feeling fresh in like a very toxic way and, making money. However, League of Legends does have a system that I've been had a lot of praise for recently, where every week, there would be a new rotation of free characters. 10 of them, I believe, and everybody could use these characters. They were the same for everybody, I think. And so that would create a kind of like little microclimate metagame to some extent, especially at lower levels where players didn't have as many characters. Maybe a certain type of character that has a slow on her ranged attacks is available for free. And so that becomes sort of part of the character of the game for a week. You sort of learn that more, and it becomes more meaningful to learn ways to counter that character, things like that. Now, a good amount of this is PvP focused, but that's okay. Now we're finally back to the premise of this parlay, which I hope makes sense now. So those games with all those features, but imagine that they had a seasonal rotation of characters and build paths, rather than moving the balance of the game forward, sort of forever destroying the things behind. What if we progressed the game's balance in a different pattern? For example, just by moving forward for a short time and then resetting, or moving in a spiral. I'll get back to that. I said I was going to get back to that before already. Because we are. Because for the first half of this parlay, I do want to talk about it in the context of these games, but I'm much more interested in the idea more broadly. So I do want to spend some time talking about that as well. But let's talk about it in these games. Yeah, I think that one nice aspect of this is that it progresses the player's knowledge rather than making them feel like there's always a new thing they need to learn and understand. And it likely makes the new things added to the game more significant in a way, because they have a context around them that people understand. So in other words, let's say that for one season we do, these 10 characters are available for free, and there are these items available. And the next season, most items are going to become unavailable, and we're going to rotate what characters are free, and we're going to make new items available for purchase, new counterplay options, new build options, etc. Now, this does mean that you can not nerf, but literally just remove a strategy from the game. Something is being used all the time, and you think the players are getting bored of seeing it all the time, just take it out entirely for one season, and then put it back in. No need to nerf it if you don't think it should be nerfed. You can balance it however you think is good, and still keep things fresh by literally just removing it, or adding in a piece of counterplay against it that's pretty strong, but only for some seasons, not always. Have there be different ways of countering the thing. It's there. There isn't direct things that counter it, but there's a lot of competition. It's there, and there are a lot of things that counter it. It isn't there some seasons, etc. I'm not sure everybody would like this necessarily. For example, for making builds, I don't feel like that approach would appeal to a lot of people. Something that you like just gets removed. It seems better to try to balance it. But for a competitive environment, I actually think this is in some ways interesting, especially because items in these games are, again, kind of not intended, I would argue, to be build options. They're kind of there as a way to counterplay opponents. So you can sort of change the metagame aspect of the game without focusing so much on changing like minor details in the game. That's interesting, particularly for a PvP focused experience. I'm still pretty excited about this idea in general, so again, I do want to talk about that more. But make no mistake, I think that's cool, pretty good. I'm not sure everybody would love, their reliable strategy they have is building 6 lifesteal swords or whatever. But you have to pay some price when you develop things, and I think it's perfectly fine to make a game where it actually is good to use somewhat a variety of options at the expense of players who literally just spam one thing over and over again, not being able to do that every season. League of Legends even provides, you just want to build damage. Here you go. Here's a build template for just building damage right in the game interface. Another reason this would work well for League of Legends that I'm pretty keen on using for other games is the idea that League of Legends item building is kind of centered around basic pieces that you then build out further. So to explain, it would be something like, the attack damage characters are building a bunch of swords. The item's icon is a sword. The flavor, I don't know, because a lot of them are shooting arrows or whatever. But the item that gives you the stats, they're just stat sticks. But the icon is a sword. So there's, the serrated sword that gives you crit chance, and the sword with blood dripping from it that gives you lifesteal, and da-da-da-da-da. But they're built out of basic items that are like a plain sword that just gives you some more damage. A scythe or whatever, I don't really remember, that gives you just some lifesteal, etc. And so those pieces can stay the same, and then you remove some of the options to kind of upgrade those items and add new ones from time to time, rather than removing the entire process of building up attack damage. You see what I mean? So another thing I like is that this lets you make big changes to the game without requiring much more knowledge from the player. The thing you do to get your whatever counterplay option you want or whatever damage increase you want is the same. You buy the basic items and then you upgrade them into whatever form. Just what upgrades are available is different. That's much more manageable for the player to keep up with. All of the variants of you can mix up gameplay in some way and make new build options. This is kind of a key problem, in my opinion. How do you prevent the player from just being drowned under needing to learn like a million things all the time? Some players don't mind, but I think it makes the game like very unlikely to be playable by most normal people. This is not just, oh, it would have a niche audience. This is like, no, you have to have an uncommon among humanity amount of free time to keep up with the game. I think it's much better if the game has a way that you get the most change, but the least new things need to be learned. An example of this being done really badly are things like board game expansions. They often add the most new pieces while changing the gameplay loop the least. You add the most new learning, but very little different experience. Shade to some board game expansions. I think a lot of the time it's kind of a miss. I'm much more interested in you literally remade the game and kind of added things to the gameplay loop. Again, an interesting topic for another time. But yeah, this is sort of what I have to say about it in League of Legends. I know I sound like a broken record. I think it's a good idea. I think it allows the game to sort of spiral toward better balance over time as well. I'm going to get into that in a few minutes. I know I keep saying that. We are spiraling, boo, toward that topic. But I think it's good. It doesn't really mean that the player with this current structure is going to make builds necessarily, like in the way we normally think of them. Choices based on their preference that are, relatively equally powerful. I would argue that isn't really how League of Legends is designed. That's sort of, there isn't an easy way that could be the case. In fact, an entire question for PvP games with build options is how, though, if the game has counterplay? You see what I mean? Isn't the entire premise of a game where you have these options, but your opponent has options that matter, therefore the good option will be the one that addresses the opponent's options, or they're not meaningful, or the game doesn't have meaningful interaction. You could make a game that is like technically PvP but doesn't have meaningful interaction. I would argue that wouldn't be that good. And you could make a game that didn't have meaningful options for players to choose build paths, but did have counterplay. But if the game has both, it kind of feels like that means you're not supposed to choose, the option you like the most. Therefore, the options are going to be used for counterplay. How exactly you would make a game where you're meant to use like your playstyle and build things a certain way, but also there is counterplay for your opponent, I am not entirely sure. An idea off the top of my head is that there are two builds in this theoretical game. One of them is yours, which is the way you want it to be, and the other one is for your opponent, and it is more general. In other words, there are sort of two build systems, but one of them is intended to be your choices that you like, that are, various different playstyle options that are relatively equally viable, and the other one is intended to be counterplay tools. They aren't the same purpose. There are some games I've played that kind of do this. Legion TD2. Legion TD2 is a game that you may be interested in if you're interested in exploring that subject. It's pretty... I think it's still free. Try it. I'm not going to say anything more about it because this is just going to be too long already. But yeah, that is a game that kind of does that. You sort of build your defenses. It's sort of a PvP tower defense game. And you build your defenses while also kind of build crafting a set of additional reinforcements to send to your opponent, along with the enemies that are already going to be attacking them this wave. And the units you pick, you kind of choose from a selection of units for your defenses. So you're kind of build crafting things the way you like them. But then for your opponent, you're both choosing to send each other reinforcements, attackers reinforcements, from like a set pool of enemies. There isn't the same type of choice at work because it isn't really meant for the same reason. You're meant to send this dude when your opponent has fast attacking units that don't do much damage per hit, and this guy when they have like a lot of units that are really spread out, and etc. There are various different mercenaries you can sick on your opponent that counter different aspects of how their build might be. So the game is interesting in that there is definitely counterplay. And another thing I like is that the way to win is often to understand your opponent's build, to go look at their build while your mercenaries are attacking and see what are they doing? Like, what is the idea behind this thing they've made? And then by dissecting that, you can kind of go from there. Now, I think one of the drawbacks of Legion TD2 is that it is fairly large. Like, there's a lot of these options, and it's a fairly complicated game. Getting good damage out of your units is kind of complicated. If you're interested in geometry, perhaps you could give this game a look. That is often how you like tessellate your units on the battlefield is often what determines how they do the most damage. It's interesting that way. A cool game, but my point is that having it sort of rotate in seasons of options would be kind of interesting, potentially. Now, for a lot of these games, there are a lot of options for mercenaries to send to your opponent. There are a lot of items in League of Legends that you can choose to build to counter people, because there are a fair amount of different things you'd want to counter. So for both of these games, and for games like them, you may need to add more total options, but then remove some of them from time to time. And again, I'm a little bit concerned that while over time the game would probably get more balanced, it feels like there would be some early seasons that would just be bad if you did that. You could make them really short, or another thing that could be interesting would be to provide like 4 of them at the same time and horribly split your game's multiplayer queue, but whatever, we're just thinking about the design idea. It's not a real game. That's bad, but let's just say you did that. And there's sort of 4 different versions of like a meta for that season. And the one that the most people play is the one that becomes the one for the next like 3 months or whatever, I'm just worried that quite a few of them would be really bad. It would be actually really hard to recombine, only portions of the game's design that way. What I'm getting at is you would kind of have to do designs to counter certain things multiple different ways, which that would be hard in its own way. That still sounds kind of cool though. I don't know. Now, I said I wanted to get a little bit more into the idea of of this type of design, sort of having a rotation of builds and characters more in general. So while it will have to do with this, it doesn't necessarily have to be something you use in a game with PvP, or I guess with build systems, though that is how I'm going to talk about it. We already talked about the point where there's a benefit of this where you don't have to sort of artificially, well, it is artificial, but you don't have to shake up the meta, quote unquote, by making the game literally worse, like worse balanced. You can make the game differently balanced and move toward a state of balance that is better overall, rather than having your only option for shaking the game up be to make it bad, like to make it worse for a little while, periodically. So that's a huge win. I mean, there's a lot of costs. It would take a lot of effort to balance a game this way. But a gigantic win is that you can attempt to make the game good. You kind of can't do that with the sort of design that League of Legends was using previously. Your job is not to make the game better. That seems ungood. Having your interests align with the player is a big trick of commercial development, at least. You have to kind of disarm, because you're trying to make money, or you have to try to make money, and the player wants to have fun. You do have to figure out a compromise where you trying to make money makes the game more fun. And I think a lot of games have really failed to do that. A lot of examples of success would be, we've talked about games like, Genshin Impact or gacha system examples, where even though gambling for characters isn't a good form of monetization, it does kind of align the developer and publisher's interests with the player, in that they have to make characters that you would be somewhat interested in using, therefore they have their own individual merits, they're relatively well designed, or you won't care about acquiring new characters because they would be useless unless the game is designed in a way where they're not. So that's good. And I want to go a step further in this little end of the discussion. Maybe this is a clever way to design a game, in that you're kind of building a game that teaches the developer to be good at balancing things. Let me explain. So I said all those times before, because I am an idiot sometimes, that I'm going to spiral toward the point about making the balance kind of spiral in on itself, rather than just moving forward and kind of destroying what was left behind. What I meant was that over the seasons of, let's use our League of Legends example again, coming back to those pieces of design, you would understand their place in the game quite keenly, And as you kept coming back to them over and over again, you don't have to get rid of them or make something new that's overpowered. You're not, supposed to do that. There's no need to do that to shake things up. You can add in new things that are balanced, and their power will already wiggle around a little bit due to changing, what's available in the game. You're gonna have to release a lot of balance patches for this type of game. But again, whatever, we're not gonna worry about that right this second. We're not gonna shut down the good idea just because we're not sure how to do it. Well, you can, but I'm not going to. Over time, you would create a game that helped the developer understand what was and wasn't good for what reason. Now, it might seem like, well, they're supposed to know that, though. But they just don't. They don't. A lot of games, I constantly complain, are not very well balanced, and a problem with build systems is that that's more important, maybe only important, for a game that has lots of different options, real meaningful choices. They're not meaningful unless the game is well balanced. That is both one of the harder things to do, and it doesn't clearly benefit the game unless it's meant to have lots of different options like that. Obviously, if you play a game that has skill trees, I'm thinking of some Assassin's Creed examples I haven't played but have seen videos of. You want them to seem like they have relative merits over each other. But you don't need to do too much work balancing them if the player isn't going to play a bunch of different times, and if the game isn't heavily marketed on you making multiple builds. You see what I mean? On the other hand, if you make something like Hades, or a game where you get upgrades as you go, they reset when you die, well, the options have to be relatively balanced because the player is going to need to use most of the different options in the game. So if some of them are just bad, the player will at the least notice. It's not the end of the world. Maybe we're going to die anyway, but that will be more felt. Most players will experience that regardless of whether they're interested in making builds, because the game just does serve up a variety of different options. Offering different gods in Hades in different seasons and having it be that the rotation of gods changes, but there are still only 8 core Olympians, which, if we've talked about Hades together, some of you in the audience, you would know that a big aspect of making a build in Hades intentionally is that there aren't too many different gods you can get. So you can use probability to make it relatively likely that you'll get a certain one you're interested in. And then you can use keepsakes to get them if you don't. So adding more gods to Hades, well, if you just added more, it would make the game random in a way it wasn't before. But if you rotated them in, that's a different story. And it would help the player understand what it would help the developer understand what the player thought the merits of each god were. That seems good. You would kind of create your game in such a way that it became a teaching tool for the player, I guess, but for the developer to kind of understand balance better. This might sound kind of weird to some people, that the piece of art being made isn't trying to be something that is sort of perfect out of the gate or as good as it can be out of the gate. It might be frustrating to hear the suggestion that you're sort of intentionally making a game that isn't, set up the way you think would be good out of the gate. And instead you're making a game that makes you, the developer, a better developer, so you can make future versions of the game better. But I would argue that most games aren't good out of the gate anyway. And game development is a difficult discipline with not a great way to learn it. Like, there isn't really a great way to be taught to do these things better. So using the thing that you're making to make you better at the thing is perfectly sensible. And I'm also going to argue for a few minutes that it's common. I think it's more common than you'd think for artists to not say so, but to make something because they want to be better at some aspect of it. Certainly, I have no difficulty running your ear off about the fact that I do this in my own videos. I've frequently said that Parley is essentially just mental jumping jacks to make me have as many different perspectives or ideas as possible, and to be able to talk about things and give kind of a good video or listening experience off the cuff. This is kind of training to make me good at that while multitasking, because I think I am already unusually good at it, just not that good compared to how good you could be. If everybody in the world, all humans, offered Parley, I think I would still be high on the list of people you'd want to pick, not to brag. I'm not bragging. I'm not that good at it. I just think I'm maybe better compared to the non-existent competition. Not exactly saying much, right? The purpose is to make me a more potent person. I'm a person where I think that this is sort of in my wheelhouse. It's a skill I can cultivate. And so what if I made that very strong by just doing it nearly every day for 10 or 20 years? Seems like that would be pretty awesome to see the product of someone being forced to answer some friggin' random question, possibly every day or so, for a very long time, especially from a wide variety of different people. At the same time, you all know me well enough that you're asking me questions that are like sort of relevant to me. So I'm getting more practice in the vague area of topics that I want to be good at discussing as well. The best of both worlds. I'm not just gaining meaninglessly broad ability to talk about any arbitrary subject. That's not useful. I want it to be about things which I consider to be valuable vaguely, which for me, that's a pretty wide shotgun spread. So I think that it's perfectly sensible to have a game that is developed in such a way that the developer is made to be better at balancing it over time. Can I think of some great examples of this subject? Looking at a game's statistics is sort of one thing, I guess. I think that game modes with we were talking about things like the roguelike gameplay loop where you get random upgrades as you go and then they reset when you die. That gameplay loop is kind of like a super duper mini version of the thing that vampbug introduced in this Parley. Kind of like every single run is a tiny mini 20-minute season where, in Hades, for example, you get Zeus, Poseidon, Aphrodite, and Demeter, and that's the meta for that run. There is no Dionysus in the run. He's not part of the run. You can add them with a keepsake, but let's just imagine you don't. For that little run, half of the gods, temporarily, are the only half available. And that's just kind of the meta for that run. And then looking at, like, oh, when people have Zeus, Poseidon, Aphrodite, and Demeter as their 4 gods available for a run, people aren't picking that many Aphrodite boons or whatever. Huh. Like, why is that? And then you could look at it across a bunch of data. Sure, I suppose that's a thing you could do. A point I want to make is that not doing this kind of gives you the opposite. Like, you get bad data about it, unteaches you to balance things well. Examples would be, well, Warframe is one we've talked about a lot. This is a game where the game is moving forward and adding tons of new stuff all the time. But this causes kind of microclimates where for one reason or another, items are kind of jostled to the top of the heap in perception, even if not in reality, and things will seem to be really, really strong in certain contexts because the game is a machine gun of contexts that are always switching and always becoming outdated and always being added to. There's no way that something isn't just gonna happen to feel overpowered in one of those. That's like if you did the seasonal thing and I said it would be a lot of balance updates, but then you just kept going. You kept increasing the number of different contexts. You're making it harder for yourself to make there be good balance. Again, because I think Warframe has no real intention of maintaining like too much balance. We've talked a lot about how, very separate topic, games like this often make what seems like a balance change, but it's actually just there to sort of force people to use different things. Again, this is much more the League of Legends making the new thing overpowered trend. And when developers don't make the new thing overpowered, sometimes there's a tendency to nerf the thing that is considered overpowered just so players find a new thing that they think is overpowered. They kind of both do the same thing. It sort of sounds worse to release the new thing overpowered, but in reality it's maybe better. I don't know, like they're both really bad, like basically the worst approach in my opinion, but maybe the other version is even worse, because at least when a game releases the new thing overpowered, unless you're a complete idiot, if you play League of Legends, you learn, okay, they're gonna nerf this character in like 2 weeks. What kind of moron wouldn't notice that playing that game? Whereas in Warframe, it's just chaos, what gets, powered down or whatever. So, maybe it's better. They're both really bad. Why am I comparing these two things? So yeah, most of what I have to say is that, I think the idea that you make a game that kind of teaches the developer or helps the developer become good at balancing games, because I feel like almost no developers are good at balancing games. Nearly every game that is considered really good, but there's something people don't like, the thing is it's badly balanced. Simple examples would be a lot of people I've heard say this about Elden Ring. That isn't a game I've played. Warframe, I think one of the biggest weaknesses is the relatively all over the place balance of things. Not even necessarily things not being equal. There's a lot of cool effects in the game where the balance is just, it's like relative nonsense. It wasn't really thought about how this would actually work at all in gameplay. It's just the idea with essentially no mind to it being practical added in, which is bad. It makes it basically useless, where you could just change how much of the thing it did, and it would suddenly be good, but that is balancing, which I don't think is done well most of the time. And so if that's the case, well, yeah, I mean, there's a question about whether it's beneficial to a lot of games beyond a point, but I think it's so bad in so many games, it seems appropriate to have some methodology by which you make it better. And it seems like an interesting one would be having a sort of rotation system in the game somehow. Maybe just as a separate game mode. It doesn't have to be the whole game either. Again, you got to worry about splitting queues, but especially if the game is single player, you could just add a mode that has some form of rotation like this. Sometimes games have these things where it's like they have a daily challenge that you can do with like various different challenge parameters, and the meta wouldn't be robust enough if that was a thing for a long time, but you can just play it for that day and it's fine. You basically break the meta within the span of a few tries, but that can be interesting in and of itself, and then you go from there. Sort of like a puzzle, using the gameplay systems that were previously not intended to be a puzzle. That's interesting. And again, that type of system could conceivably sort of teach a developer how to balance their game better over time. I am going to do something really annoying now, which is for a few minutes, I'm going to say, oh, but you could also just make it perfectly balanced from the start. Yeah, you could make a system that is inherently balanceable instead. I think the real problem for a lot of games is not that their balance is so bad or that the developer is so bad at balancing, as much as the developer didn't try to make a game that is easy to balance, because that isn't a thing that was a priority of the games. But then they were so bad at balancing the game that even though it isn't a big priority, they still needed to be a little good at it, but they weren't because they didn't try to make it easy to balance, blah. I think maybe trying to tackle that from the start is better. So for example, an example I give a lot in Warframe would be that if a weapon does equal damage to another weapon, but one weapon delivers the damage with a lot of small hits, and another weapon delivers that damage with one big hit, because of status chance, which can inflict conditions that make you do more damage to enemies in Warframe, the faster firing weapon is nearly always better if they have even remotely similar status chance. And in Warframe, it's very uncommon for weapons to have like more than a single order of magnitude different status chance. So a weapon might be a single fire weapon and it has 50% status chance. Sounds like a lot. But if a weapon shoots rapid fire, it might be 10 or 15 times as often at shooting as the single fire weapon. And if that weapon has like 10% status, it sounds like appropriately less, but that's actually still like 5 times as much status as the other weapon. So it ends up being way better. And you don't overkill enemies, and there are many other, I made a point like this in a video recently, there are many other reasons why the rapid fire weapon might be stronger. You can miss, and it's not as punished. You won't waste as much damage overkilling enemies. You can, like, punch through more easily, because if you wiggle the gun a little bit, you'll actually hit some enemies behind you instead of maybe missing the one shot that has all of your damage for that second through an enemy's head and then it doesn't hit another enemy's head. Like, there are many advantages even if it didn't do more damage to a rapid firing weapon, but it does end up doing more damage. So yeah, but that's the kind of thing where it feels like, couldn't you just make a rough equation that vaguely converts the effectiveness of weapons to be neutral if you want that? And then when you want a weapon to be stronger or weaker, you can use that equation to just make it be stronger or weaker by an amount that you kind of know. Because things are happening in practice and statuses are going up at different times and there are different status effects, it's not perfectly balanceable, but it's still something you could try to do. And I feel it's something that isn't done in, for example, Warframe. I feel like it's something a lot of developers just don't do. For that matter, you don't have to have a game that you need to balance manually. You could make a game that is somehow self-balancing. For example, imagine a theoretical game where when something isn't chosen for a while, it gets stronger until you choose it. Something like that. Or there are even examples, I don't really like this approach, but where when something is chosen less often by players generally, it becomes more powerful in exchange. Riven mods in Warframe, kind of. I mean, there are many ways, but those are a few, by which a game can be, maybe there's a scoring technique in the game. There's a way you get a score for your performance in this game. And then using that scoring, you can measure when a player is doing well with a weapon and poorly with a weapon. And therefore, regardless of the player saying this feels powerful or doesn't feel powerful, you can see, well, across all players, when players use this, they do get a lower score. It kind of feels like it's objectively underpowered as much as we can really know that. So I, the developer, will buff it because I've created a system in my game that kind of tells me which things are less powerful in some way. That's a very simple example. That was actually way simpler than the other examples. But go figure. You could make a game that didn't have the idea of changing the power level of an item. A game that kind of balances itself somehow. And I think that that's an interesting approach. I think doing more work to make this so it isn't something you have to worry about down the line makes a ton of sense. That's just something that most people don't do. It's hard, I guess, to have the foresight that it's going to be a big deal down the line, but I feel like since it's a problem for most games, you can pretty safely assume that it would be beneficial to habba-dabba-da. So that was, thanks for listening to my mumbling and grumbling about that. This was a fun topic. Vamper, I had posted a thing prompting people to make Parley if they wanted to, because we were getting a lot less than usual this month. And it seems like you read some of the stuff I was talking about and decided to write this prompt. And I think that that's awesome. Thank you very much. I hope people don't feel like they have to do Parley if they have it every single month. That's okay. But I want you to feel like you can. And sometimes it's like, well, I want to come up with something, but I don't want to do all the work of coming up with something. Yeah, that's kind of my job. I want to help. So thank you very much. If you want to get your own Parley like this, there's a link about that in the description. For now, thanks for listening.